All right, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. We will begin in exactly 2 minutes to review CDFM Module 1, Competency 2, Manpower Management. Good morning, this is Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. I have 11:30 Eastern Standard Time, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Does anyone have any question? Anyone on the phone line have any question on anything that we covered last week? This is your opportunity to go ahead and ask those questions. Because everything that we do from here on kind of builds on the basic knowledge of and the information that we went over last week, as far as the structure of the government, why things flow the way they do, why we have separation of powers, the different branches, who's responsible for what in the budget process. We talked about last week what happens when the funding, the budget goes to Congress. What happened? What does Congress do with it? So all those knowledge, you have to remember those things, because as we move forward, everything else will be built on the previous knowledge. Again, success in the CDFM examination is not simply about memorizing the information on the pages. You have to grasp the understanding of what is going on in that process. Who is doing what? And again, if you picture building a puzzle, when you put it all together, it makes one beautiful puzzle. But what happens on the exam when they take all the pieces of the puzzle apart and you are asked to put those pieces where they belong? Do you know who worked for Congress? Do you know who works for the president? Do you know who submits what document? If I use the word apportionment, do you know what that means or who apportions funds? So those things that we covered last week is essential in your success. Again, do I have anyone on the phone line that have any question on anything that was discussed last week, or just anything that you have before we move forward? And again, it's a study group, so it's not about you just calling in, listening to my crazy voice. It's about you asking questions so that I can better relay the information to you. I might understand it in my head, but the question is, are you comprehending the information that I'm giving out? So that's the difference between what I do is to build on what, if you've attended the EDFMT courses from that ASMC offers, and you might have some questions that were not answered there. You may have worked previously in resource management, financial management, and maybe there's some things in the process that you didn't understand. This is your opportunity to do so. Does anyone have any question? All right. So I have the line open on speakerphone because I'm also recording on the YouTube for those individuals who cannot attend the weekly sessions at this time. So it'll give them an opportunity. So I do need participation because I'm going to be asking questions. So I expect y'all to respond back. All right. So let's begin with CDFM Module 1, Competency 2. I'm using the 2020 study guide, and the topic is manpower management. So last week we talked about how we get the funding. and how things flow, because it matters. It matters also because it determines the manpower levels that we are able to sustain, because everything is based on money. How much money does it take to sustain and still be able to be successful in our mission? So the mission of the Department of Defense begins on page 1.2.5. It talks about the introduction to defense manpower management. And just looking at the diagram, don't sit there and try to remember, okay, as of this particular date in 2019, the Army had 1.3 million. No, you need to understand the Army is the largest, then you have the National Guard and the reserves and the civilian workforce. All those three entities together make up the Department of Defense. So what is the mission of the Department of Defense? We talked last week about the Constitution. Everything that we do is in support of, in defending that Constitution. So that's the mission of the Department of Defense. Secure the country, defend. And it utilizes the DoD military departments. There are 3 military departments: Army, Navy, Air Force, and everything that I'm talking about is listed in that paragraph. Again, you have to get to the point where you first read through the information, pull out the important things, and then you should be able to just look at the page and do what I'm doing. Just articulate, what is that topic about? What is that section about? Do we have any question on the mission of the Department of Defense, the manpower management, when it comes to manpower management? Any question? Can y'all hear me well? Yes? Okay. Okay. All right. So it's made up of 3 military departments and 20 defense agencies. Your commissaries and so forth, DFAS, those are all defense agencies. And then there are 5 armed services. So don't get caught up. If it asks you for military departments, there's only 3 of those. If it asks you for armed services, you have 5 of those, which includes the Space Force, which is the newest command. Let's see, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and the Space Force. So that's the difference in this study guide. And if you have an older version, most likely the Space Force will not be in there. So 2020 study guide has 5 DoD services: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and the Space Force. All right, on page 126, pretty straightforward. You have the definition of manpower management. The processes for determining manpower requirements for budgetary purposes and reporting manpower strengths to OMB. What does OMB stand for? Who do they work for? Let me hear you. Anybody? OMB, what does it stand for? Where you at, Eunice?
Office of Management and Budget.
Okay. Office of Management and Budget. Who do they work for?
President.
The president, which is what branch of government? Excuse me.
Executive.
The executive branch. So those things should come as you snap your fingers. And it's talking about, again, everything is based on funding. So what it's saying is your manpower is based on your budgetary restrictions, guidance, manpower requirements, what I need versus the budget that I am allowed to have. So everything, as we talked about last week, the budget flows through OMB because it goes to the president. On page 127, the first bullet, it says the first priority for programming manpower is the major command, those combatant commanders. Who can tell me why? So again, it's about comprehension. Don't just take the information as is. You have to be able to understand, why does the combatant commanders have first priority? And think about the DoD mission and all of that we went over. All right, go ahead. Anybody gonna take a stab at it?
The combatant commanders each have a large area of responsibility over the entire world as far as operations.
All right, so combatant commanders, even if you haven't been through module 2, because this is also, remember, all the modules overlap. So in module 2, you dig a little bit deeper into the combatant commanders. But remember, the mission of the Department of Defense is not for people to work on Fort this and Fort that. No, the mission is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and so forth and so forth. How do we do that? The globe is broken down into different regions, and those regions are manned by combatant commanders. So when you get to module 2, what you'll see is operational chain of command. The operational mission of the Department of Defense runs from the President through the SecDef, Secretary of Defense, to those combatant commanders. Again, operational, and it's not in the book in front of you. Because I know that from module 2, operational chain of command runs from the President to the SecDef, or through the SecDef to the combatant commanders. So that's some key players you have to be familiar with. So when it says that priority for programming manpower, the priority doesn't go to the various installation. The priority goes to ensure that those combatant commanders have what they need. In that same bullet, it talks about based on the Joint Chiefs of Staff guidance. That's another key individual that's going to continuously come up in the study guide. What is the role of the Joint Chief of Staff or Chiefs of Staff? Each one of those agencies or military departments, each military department has a Joint Chief of Staff. What is the role of the Joint Chief of Staff? Who knows that? Y'all don't want me playing the Jeopardy music, do you?
Advise the president.
So they advise, right? So your president is a civilian. Your Secretary of Defense is a civilian. Your top military advisors, the top folks in uniform, they sit as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So as the combatant commanders send up their requests that they want to get to the Secretary of Defense, it has to go through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So that the Joint Chief of Staff, because they're top military, they can translate it into a language that the Secretary of Defense, that the President, that the National Security Council can understand. So that's why they say their priority, what they get in manpower, is based on guidance or recommendation from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What is the role of the individual in charge of the Joint Chief of Staff? Because every group has one single point. Not the Army's not talking to the SecDef, not each one of them. They all have one spokesperson. What is the role of that one spokesperson? What is their title?
The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
The chairman. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is the one that's actually communicating. So even though we said operational chain of command runs from the president through the SecDef to the combatant commanders, but the orders actually flow through the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Any question on that? Okay, so I'll let you read through the other bullets. On page 128, it has some definitions that you have to be familiar with. The difference between actual, strength, assigned, authorized. Because all of these, as we know, we typically get our funding based on what we are authorized. So make sure that you read through that. I also, excuse me. Hold on. I also want to point out on that chart a term, future year defense program, because that term will come up several times in this module and in the subsequent ones, module 2 and 3. So the future year defense program is a DoD database that summarizes all the resources necessary to accomplish a mission. That's me just paraphrasing. The definition is listed on page 128. So what it is, FYDP, the Future Year Defense Program is a DoD database that they keep updated. So based on DoD's mission, whatever that mission is, there's resources associated with doing that mission. And that is published in the Future Year Defense Program. On page 129, it goes into mobilization and crisis issues. It tells you how, if we don't have enough manpower on staff, it tells you what we can do to transition from peacetime to wartime. So that's pretty much information you can read through. And how do you mobilize soldiers? I am going to jump to page 1211, which talks about presidential authority to activate reserve forces. So remember last week we looked at the primary roles of Congress, the primary roles of the president, but there's some instances when it comes to activating forces, the president of the United States has some authority. So that's what you need to understand here. So we're going to go through a few things before I start this information. All right, so we already said that the president belongs to the executive branch. Which article in the Constitution governs what the president can or cannot do? Check on learning.
Article 8. Article 2.
Article 2. Again, if you learn legislative, executive, judicial, now you know Article 1, Article 2, Article 3. So Article 2 of the Constitution governs what the president or the executive branch is allowed to do. Also, some key things you need to understand. Title 10 of the law, 10 U.S. Code Title 10, governs your active and reserve forces. It doesn't say it on the page. I'm just giving it to you. What title governs what the National Guard can do? Anyone knows?
32.
Title 32. So Title 32. So these are just some things you just have to know. Title 10, most of your active and reserve. Title 32 governs the National Guard. Because remember, we talked about earlier, the structure of DoD is made up of active, reserve, National Guard, and civilians. So which title governs civilians? Title 5. And the reason, if you ask, okay, why is she going over stuff that's not on the page? Because again, the exam is not going to just cover what's on that page. It's going to assume that you've done some research, you've done some background reading, and you also know a little bit more about that topic. So we went over Title 10. Title 32 governs the National Guard, and Title 5 governs your civilian. All right. So as we're talking about Title 10 here, you already know, okay, they're not addressing National Guard or they're not addressing civilian. So we know who else is left. So under this authority, Title 10 U.S. Code 12304, that should be easy to remember, right? 1234. The president has several authorities. The first bullet says the president can activate reserve forces in emergency situation where you have threatened use of weapons of mass destruction, a terrorist attack, or threaten terrorist attack. So you have three conditions that must be met or can be met for the president to activate forces. What this means is without having to go to Congress, because remember, Congress drives everything. It's not the president, because the Congress can say no. But under the law, the president can activate reserve forces if you have a threatened use of weapons of mass destruction, a terrorist attack, or a threat of a terrorist attack. Now there he's restricted without the consent of Congress. So he doesn't need Congress to do this. However, he can only activate these forces for 365 days or less. The second bullet is also letting you know in that reserve forces is made up of selective reserve and IRR, individual ready reserve. So not more than 200,000 members of both. When you combine the selective reserve and the IRR, that total cannot exceed 200,000 individuals in the reserve forces on active duty within that year for that event. And of that 200,000, not more than 30,000 may be members of the IRR, individual ready reserve. Any question on that? So there's a few things that you have to know from those two bullets. Any question? So it's pretty straightforward. Okay, I don't hear anything. We'll drive on. On page 1 to 12, civilian employees during a crisis situation. So there are different definitions of position. And typically, if you have civilian individuals who are activated, if something occurs, their position is already coded. They know, okay, if this unit deploys, I'm going to have to deploy because this position is coded as mission essential or whatever that category is. So you have emergency essential. There's some positions that are emergency essential. If an emergency occurs, that individual should already know beforehand that they can be called up. So make sure you read through those crisis definitions for civilian employees. Some other civilian employee definitions you need to be familiar with is on page 1 to 13. And even though, because I don't think it's clear, since sometimes when you're in the military, you're not familiar in civilian terms, you need to know what an FTE is, because it's not listed directly on the page, but they use it in that paragraph. So it's not in the chart, but it's in that paragraph. Personnel budget estimates are prepared in terms of full-time equivalent employment. What does FTE mean? What does FTE mean? Anyone?
What employee working like a normal day, full-time, like 40 hours a week?
Right, so a full-time civilian employee working 40 hours a week, they're full-time, in most cases, permanent employees. So whenever you hear the term FTE, full-time equivalent, there's some terms in the chart, table 122, that you have to know. And it's not that they're going to ask you necessarily for the definition. They might say, based on the data that is given to you, calculate the turnover rate. Well, only how you're going to know how to calculate the turnover rate is you have to know that number of employees who left a position divided by the number of positions that you have. So you have to know the definition so that if they say calculate the lapse rate, then based on your knowledge, the percentage of the year a vacancy occurs, turnover rate times the fill rate equals lapse rate. So for each one of these on the chart on the bottom of page 1 to 13, you need to learn the definition, what the word is, the FTE equivalent terminology is, and how to do the calculations. Because you're not going to be asked, okay, what's the definition of turnover rate or full-time permanent? You're going to be most likely, if I'm asking you a test, you're going to have to know how to do some calculations based on the definitions. On page 1214, it talks about DoD separation incentives. So there's a couple of them. And if you look at the beginning of that paragraph, the first thing you see is Title V. And who does Title V govern? DoD civilians. That's why I went over it, because they talk about it, but they never explained it. So I'm giving it to you. So Title V, automatically, if it says Title V, U.S. Code, you got to make sure this is addressing civilian employees. So what does it say for the separation incentives? It says the authority may be used to reduce the number of personnel. So more so in the few years in the past, they've had like buyout programs. Third paragraph or third section, you have VSIP and VERA. VSIP is voluntary separation incentive. I mean, I'll accept a certain amount, a lump sum amount of money, so I can go ahead and get out of the military or get out of the Army, get out of the DoD. And then you also have the voluntary early retirement authority. If you qualify for VERA, the limitations, the DoD is permitted no more than 25,000 buyout separations per year. So that's a restriction under this Title V U.S. Code Section 9902. So under this authority, DoD can have no more than 25,000 buyout separations a year. The other restriction is in the next paragraph. In that same authority, it requires that buyout payments, there's some restrictions, the lesser of 40,000. So that also tells me the most you can get out of this buyout or early separation. Let me make sure I say the most you can get out of a buyout is 40,000, because it says it requires the buyout payments, the lesser of 40,000 or the amount of the employee's severance pay. So if your severance pay, whatever it is, once they do the calculation, the lesser of 40,000 or severance pay. So if your severance pay, what I'm interpreting this to mean, and if anybody say differently, is if your severance pay is more than 40,000, the most you're going to get is 40,000. That's how I interpret that. Along that same line, it says, be paid from the amounts available and generally be fully repaid if the employee rejoins the federal government within 5 years of separation. So if you take a buyout, you're limited to the 40,000, and you cannot work for the DoD 5-year period. If you get rehired in the DoD within that 5-year period, you have to pay that buyout money back. An employee accepting a buyout cannot be reemployed by DoD for another restriction after you receive the incentive pay. So you're still, either way, you're limited to a annual or 1-year holdout period to be reemployed. So you can get the money, you can be rehired within a year after that first year, but you're going to have to pay the money back. So you might want to sit out for 5.5 years and then go back and work if you so choose. All right, so that's the DoD incentive or separation incentive program. Voluntary early retirement. I'm going to retire early, so I'm going to take a less cut. I'm not going to wait till I turn, 62, 65? I don't know, because I don't plan to be there at that time. All right, what do we have next on page 1215? So any question on separation incentive, the president's authority to activate reserve forces, FTEs, crisis, situations for civilians? What are the different roles, responsibilities? Any question? I'll pause for a few. All right. I don't hear anything. Y'all still on the line with me? Occasionally I have to check because I can't hear anything. All righty. Don't sleep on me. All right. So on page 1215, as we drive on, Federal Activities Inventory Reform Act of 1998 talks about annual list of government activities not inherently governmental in nature. So this is going into having a government role and a contractor doing the job, or what are we talking about? So this is the commercial activity function is what they're going into here. So let's see what else we talk about. Government sources. So I'm going to flip to page 1217. OMB Circular A76. OMB, you already know. Whenever we receive guidance from Office of Management and Budget, it is typically published in a circular. So OMB Circular A76 always talks about commercial activity. That is where you determine if the government continues to do a job or they hire a contractor to fulfill those duties and responsibilities. Commercial activity, they give you the definition. Inherently governmental activity. That means it has to be a federal employee to do that job when you read that definition. Inherently governmental functions fall into two categories: the act of governing and monetary transactions. So kind of read through. Make sure you kind of separate the information and read through. So all of that is just information. So what is the OMB circular called for that deals with commercial activity? OMB circular, what is it? A76. So keep repeating it because you're going to eventually run into some other OMB circulars. So you need to be able to identify what topic is covered in that circular. All right, let's take it to page 1221. Even though I'm studying and I'm not reading all the information, if it's your first time going through the information, you need to read all the pages. All I'm doing is pulling out the important things that's kind of pulling that information together. The chart on page 21 is important for you to understand before you move on. Let's see, to the next slide. So it talks about conversion to contract, whether, okay, the government was doing the job. Go ahead and mute your phone if you're not talking because we can hear. Conversion to contract or conversion to in-house. Because for those who've been around the military for a while, at one point, it was all military police on the gates. Once you have like Desert Storm and all of that going on, then you had a contractors or that took over that mission while the soldiers deployed. So that's where you talk about conversion to contract, conversion to in-house. And I think now they kind of dual, where you have some contractors, I think now they're all GS, and then you still have the military police. That's just an example. Commercial source, cost comparison, performance work statement. That's where you detail exactly what needs to be done. If you've been around long enough, you've probably been in a position where you have a team of manpower managers that came around and they asked you, okay, I want you to write down everything that you do on a daily basis. What they're trying to do is to build that performance work statement so that they then later can figure out, okay, is this a job that we can give to a contractor? The one that I want to point out is not a familiar term, but when it comes to the CDFM, it's something you need to know. It's called the MEO, the most efficient organization. That is the title. If the government decides to keep a function in-house, that structure is called the most efficient organization. You either have a contractor doing it or you have the MEO structure, most efficient organization. So what does that mean? Let's flip to the top of page 1222. You'll see that chart on the top left. And this is just a short, if you work in force management or you've gone to manpower management training, you probably go a little bit more in depth in that particular chart. What this chart is saying is before a manpower study is done, Congress has to be notified. And there's some certain instances, because again, you're talking about funding. You're talking about taking money from one side, doing it something else with it. And whenever you start messing with the funding, then Congress has to be notified. On the left-hand side of that chart, it says there's a request for study contract. There's an award of that study contract because they got to do a test. They got to do a study to figure out what exactly do we do as government employees. And if I have a contractor, I need a performance work statement to let them know these are all the functions of things that has to be done. And then you start the study. That's the bottom left of that chart and the top of page 22. So when you do that study, a couple of things happen. The first part, you develop the MEO. Most organizations, you might have PDs where you actually list certain functions, but we all know on a day-to-day basis, we do more than what's listed on those documents. So when you develop the MEO, is you're actually trying to figure out what exactly does these employees do. So the MEO is developed. And out of the MEO, you complete the performance work statement because that's what it's building. So then the performance work statement is used to solicit contractors to see how much a contractor would charge the government to do that function. And on the MEO side, they complete an independent cost estimate. If we had to put an actual cost to the performance, cost to the job, how much will it actually cost? And when you take those two costs together, you do a cost comparison on the chart at top of page 22. You do a cost comparison. And then a decision is made. And remember, cost is easy to say. This one's cheaper. This one is more expensive. But I'm sure there are always other categories. Are we trying to improve timeliness? Can they do it? Which one does it more? Which one enhances morale? Which one alleviates personnel? So there are other conditions other than cost. But for this particular purpose, cost comparison is done. Then you have an opportunity to administer appeals. And when the final decision is made, Congress has to be notified again before that contract is awarded, whether it's keeping it in-house, the MEO contract, or a vendor is then, our contractor is awarded that contract. So the diagram kind of helps to tie in all the information on page 22, page 23, 24. On page 24, yeah, so we talked about all of that. So on page 24, and the slide on the top left, you see that 10%. The non-incumbent of the work must beat the incumbent by 10% of the government personnel cost. So when they're doing this cost comparison, part of it is not just that the contractor is cheaper than the government. How much cheaper is it? So it's at least got to be 10% better than the government. So that's part of one of the guidelines there. The length of the process. The average time for a standard competition when you do a manpower study is 12 months, and it can be extended to 18 months. There are instances on that last paragraph at the bottom with the length of the process where you have to streamline the process. Going back to my example with the military police used to be on the gate 100%. When the wars kicked off, they had to streamline that process because those soldiers had to go. They had to deploy. And so that streamlining process, it didn't take another 12 months, another 18 months, is you notice that contractors started having people on those gates. So what it's telling you is a streamlined process may be used if competition involves 65 full-time equivalent employees or less, and under the streamlined process, the 10% factor is not applicable. It doesn't matter because the government personnel has to leave that position. So if you streamline it, the 10% factor, the 10% rule is not a factor. Any question on 876? Let me see over here. On page 25, I don't hear anything, so I'm going to go ahead. 876 announcement. Congressional notification. Well, let's see what it says there. And I'm going to read it so you can see it. DoD components must notify, even though it says shall, but just go ahead and say must notify Congress of the intention to do a cost comparison when it involves 46 or more DoD civilian positions. So remember, going back to that chart, it's not just that every study that's done, you got to go to Congress. Here now they're telling you the conditions. If it involves 46 or more DA civilians, then Congress must be notified. The DoD component shall also notify the USD PNR personnel and readiness of any such intent at least 5 working days before the congressional notification. The cost comparison process begins on the date of congressional notification. The second bullet on page 25. DoD, you got to notify the employees. DoD components shall consult the DoD civilian employees who will be affected by the cost comparison. So whether you decide, you don't wait until you decide, okay, your job is going to be going over to contractors. So that means your job is going to go away. You need to let those employees know what the plan is. If it goes to a contractor, are you going to find them something else within the organization, or do they have to start looking for another job? So congressional notification, that's important. 46 employees, DoD civilian positions, and notify the employees. All right, so now we're getting ready to switch. So switch your mindset. So make sure that you kind of recap all those things we went over, because what we're going into is really part of fiscal law, but it's listed in module 1. It's talking about ethics, what things you can or cannot do as a employee of the Department of Defense. Ethics begins on page 26, but we're going to go on page 1-27. The first one is gifts from outside sources. Can I accept a gift from a contractor? There's contractors that we deal with. Sometimes they come with a little pen, pencil, a pad, a calendar. Can I legally accept it without having to hide it? You know? All right. So the first bullet and the second set of bullets says, yes, I can accept it, but the value of that gift cannot exceed $20. And from that same contractor annually, it doesn't say for fiscal year, it says annually, from that same contractor, if they come with a pen and the pen is $19 and they come back with another gift and the other gift is $20, can I accept it? Yes, as long as it stays under $50 within that year, you can accept the gift. So that's something important to know. The rest of it is kind of straightforward. If your relationship is personal with that contractor, you could do it on a personal. But in most of these cases with fiscal law, as they always tell you with your fiscal law training, if you're not sure, then go to your ethics lawyers. Get some second opinion, get some legal opinion. So gifts from outside, yes, I can accept a gift from a contractor if the cost of the gift is $20 or less and no more than $50 within a year. On page 1228, gifts between employees. And typically from what I've read through, it's usually gifts to a superior, gifts to a supervisor is where the limitations are. But for the most part in fiscal law, they say use the same guidance. What does it say? Executive branch employees may not make a gift. So remember, you fall under the executive branch. 3 branches of government. You fall on the executive branch. That is why the budget goes from the executive branch to Congress. And the Congress watches, guides, dictates what the executive branch can do with the budget. So it says executive branch may not make a gift to an official superior, nor can an employee accept a gift from another employee who receives less pay, except in certain circumstances. On an occasional basis, including occasion when gifts are traditionally given, what someone's leaving, they have promotion, whatever examples. The following gifts, individual gifts to a supervisors are permitted. Gifts other than cash that are valued at no more than $10. So for the most part, what we say is if they're coming around and people are asking, hey, would you like to donate? So-and-so's leaving, they're superior to you, they're supervisor to you, you are limited to $10 ethically. So there are no issues there. So for the most part, even for subordinates, we say leave it at $10 for everybody. Then you have no conflict of interest. Food and refreshments shared in the office among employees. Again, you shouldn't just buy for one. You got to buy for everyone. Personal hospitality in the employee's home that is the same as that customary provided to personal friends. So those are certain things that are permitted. I've had General so-and-so has an open house. He wants all the personnel to come through. Okay, that's permitted. There's some instances where you have to do a financial disclosure and it's dependent on your position, your job. It'll say if you have to disclose any financial interest that you have. If you have a financial transaction that you're working with a contractor outside of the organization, you may have to notify your legal folks. On page 30, because we deal with contracts and so forth, what it's saying at the bottom, remedies for avoiding potential conflict of interest. If you're doing a transaction with a company and you feel it may cause a conflict of interest, you may have to recuse yourself, separate yourself from that transaction so that there are no issues, waivers, certificates, trusts. You can read through all of that. Page 1231, seeking employment. And again, with the CDFM, it doesn't matter what you see happening around you. Because sometimes people will retire in uniform and they turn around and working for the same company that you were dealing with. Is that legal? Okay, let me mind my business. All right, so seeking other employment. Executive branch employees may not participate in any particular government matter that would affect financial interests. What are the conditions? An employee is considered seeking employment is engaged in actual negotiation. You're not just say, hey, tell me about your company. Okay, do you like it? That's different than, okay, what positions y'all have open? When are y'all hiring? That you're actually actively seeking employment. So they give you the definition of what that means. You're no longer seeking employment if either the employee or the employer rejects the possibility of employment. They talk about on page 32, misuse of position. Just because you may be chief, commander, or whatever in your role, you cannot use that position for gain. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. Outside activity, you also got to make sure your outside activity does not overlap. You can't, if you're, and we used to do it, when you're selling your Girl Scout and Boy Scout or Girl Scout cookies and send out an email to everyone on the work computer, that's wrong, right? So you're using your position personal gain. If you send it through personal email, that's different. Once you use the government email, then it becomes a conflict of interest. All right, another important thing you need to know is on the top of page 1233, honorarium. And to tell you the truth, before studying the CDFM, I had no clue what honoraria was. So I had to do some little reading. Basically, what honoraria is you do a speech, you do a lecture, you are asked to do something on the civilian side, and they pay you for it. And you have to then determine, can I legally accept payment? For example, I do the CDFM study group, been doing it since 2011, I think, 2011. I've had contractors that approach me and say, hey, can you come to our organization and teach the CDFM to our folks? We'll pay you. And me being the conscientious objector, I was like, yeah, let me go to JAG. I already knew the answer, but I wanted it, my legal folks. I cannot get paid by the government and turn around and get paid by a contractor that works for the same organization that I'm in. That's doing too much. So I cannot accept payment. So honoraria, let's say you graduated from, since I'm in North Carolina, University of North Carolina. You're alumni of U.S. University of North Carolina. You happen to work on that installation, Fort Bragg, for instance, and they call you to do the graduation speech at the University of North Carolina, and they say, we'll pay you. When you read through honoraria, they're saying, if when you are invited and they invite you on the strict premise that you are an alumni, you graduated from here and now you're doing great things, yes, you can accept the money. If they're hiring you, if they're inviting you because you are the commander of the 101st, whenever you use your title in that process, then no, you cannot accept payment from that university, from that college, because then it becomes, or they're looked upon as duplicate salary. You're getting paid twice for your position, for your role. So as we know in financial management, it's all about the words that you use. So honoraria basically says you can accept payment if on a personal level, if you're invited to do your lecture, your speech, write something for an organization, a civilian organization, they can pay you if you're not using your official capacity. Any question on honoraria? We're almost there. All right. On the bottom of page 1233, it talks about post-employment. So that's another. So you notice they keep coming back to that because we're talking about manpower. We're talking about working. 1 minute we're working with the DOD. We're engaging in contracts with different contractors on the civilian side. And now we want to retire. We want to leave the DOD. Well, can we go, or should we go and work directly for that contractor, or can we? So post-employment, there are few restrictions. Under the second bullet, it says, in addition, let's go back. All right, let's go with the bullets. The first bullet says, if the employee's involvement in such a matter, meaning that I was engaging in activities after they leave the government, if that individual has a personal and substantial, then the employee is permanently barred from representing anyone on the same matter to any federal department, agency, or court. Second bullet, if the matter was under the employee's official responsibility, let's say you're in charge, you're the COR, contracting officer representative of a particular contract, you cannot then leave the Department of Defense and then go try to work for that same company where you now know the ins and out of their contract. That's pretty much what they're trying to say here. In addition, certain high-level officials are subject to a cooling off period, 1 year, for a period of 1 year after leaving a senior position. The official may not make any appearance on behalf of any person other than the United States before his former agency with the intent to influence the agency on any matter in which that person seeks official action. Employees who participated personally, again, that's that personal relationship. You actually touched that contractor. You're a COR or you're the resource manager who certified the funds for that contract. You want to stay away from that company because they might look like, okay, you were steering those contracts to that company because you know you were going to work for that company. Just don't put yourself in that position. Post-employment. Representation to government agencies and courts. Let's see. Executive branch employees, that's you and me, are subject to criminal statutes that prohibit representation of private interests before the government. So the way it talks about right claiming, you cannot. One of these laws prohibits an employee from prosecuting a claim against the United States or represent a private party, right? You know, you're restricted. There are exceptions that will allow an employee to represent the following with or without compensation: the employee, parent, spouse, or a personal estate for which employee serves as a guardian, executive, administrator. So just kind of read through that information. I'm not going to read through all of that. Supplementation of salary. Can we supplement our salary? You work for the Department of Defense. Can you get another job somewhere? How can you do it legally to supplement what you're already making? Y'all still with me?
I would say, yeah, as long as it doesn't conflict with, I guess, what you're doing with the government.
That's a good point. As long as it doesn't conflict with your official capacity. Again, don't stay clear of if you're interacting with certain specific contractors and then you try on the personal level to still interact with them. Not because, hey, you all grew up together. No, you were just trying to work with that contractor. They'll look like insider information because, again, it's supposed to be competition of resources. So make sure that it doesn't interact with each other. So the best thing is making sure it's completely outside of. Can I work for the Department of Defense and get a job at Walmart if I want to? Can I?
Yes.
Why? How so?
Because the job is not a conflict of interest with the DoD.
Right, because Walmart does not work for the Department of the Defense. Walmart does not interact directly. I'm sure somehow indirectly, but does not directly interact with the Department of Defense. So you stay clear of things like that. So those are the kind of conditions. And again, when you see these things on the exam, they're going to give you scenarios. It's not going to be straightforward. It'll be scenario based. And then you, based on your knowledge, just like we talk about, can I do this? Is this legal? Because even though we We have ethics lawyers, as you know, the responsibility falls on us to understand the law, to understand. That's why we have to take fiscal law. We have to understand because we're the ones certifying the fund. You can say that the lawyers agree or not, but the lawyers are not the one that's actually pushing that button, clicking certified or obligating those funds. We are. And so we are held liable for those funds if they're paid out incorrectly. All right, so let's do some. That is manpower management in a nutshell. What questions do you have of me before I start asking you questions? All right, I hear no questions on the phone line. Any question on YouTube? You can type your question if you have one. All right, no questions. All right, what are some of the functions of Congress? Stop throwing them at me. There's enough of them. What are some of the functions of Congress, the legislative branch?
Raise taxes.
Raise taxes. What else? All the things you think that the president can do, but it's Congress that has the power to do it. What are some of the other things? They can raise the taxes. What else?
Borrow money.
Borrow money. Declare war. It's not the function of the president. So that's why it's important when you have, in this my political injection, whatever you vote, whether you're Democrat, Republican, I don't care, just vote, is ensure that you vote for your senators, because they're the ones, your House of Representatives, your senators, they're the ones that have the power to raise taxes, borrow money, declare war, raise and support armies, all of that. They're the ones that grant the power to take money out the Treasury. If Congress never comes up with a budget, we're restricted. What is the term when we have no appropriation law come 1 October and they give us a temporary appropriation? What is the name of that temporary appropriation? The continuing resolution. Where can I find that in the Constitution? Because I told you that's the only one I expect everybody to know. What part of the Constitution talks about what will happen if we have no appropriation law? The government was shut down. What part of the law, what part of the Constitution talks about that?
Article 1, Section 8.
Is that your final answer? Good tries. Somebody want to help out? What?
Section 9.
Section 9. Article 1, Section 9. Everybody needs to know it. I don't care if you remember none of the other ones. You need to know the reason why the government shuts down if we don't have an appropriation law, if we don't have a continuing resolution. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury unless we have an appropriation law in place. The only how you're going to have an appropriation law is if Congress appropriates the funds. Because in the end result, regardless of what the president disagrees or agrees with, if the Congress have 2/3 votes, they can override whatever the president wants. So they have to come to an agreement. All right. So we said that Article 1 governs Congress. We say Article 2 governs the executive branch or the president, and Article 3 governs the courts, makes the laws, executes the laws, reviews the laws, right? Interprets the laws. So let's see, congressional actions. What are the 3 ways in which a legislation begins? I had to figure out how to ask that question. What are the 3 ways? What are the 3 ways in which they can begin a legislation? Whether it's a bill, a general legislation. Originate from
the president.
The president. What's the next one?
The members.
Members of Congress and or what's the third one? There's three of them. The committees of Congress. Because remember, every part of Congress has House of Representatives and the Senate, and each one of those have committees and subcommittees. So originate from the president. And how does the president typically originate a bill? During what process?
State of the Union.
The State of the Union address is usually his first point, where he lets them know these are the things, these are the bills, these are the legislation that I'm going to be introducing, working on. And so when the bill is initially introduced or given to the committee, it enters, what's the term? You place it in the hopper. So you have it, the bill package, you place it in the hopper. You place it in the incoming box. That's your hopper. You got to get it through the process. So then the committee, whichever committee is responsible for that particular bill, they review it. They have you come in, they do public hearings. They want you to justify. Why are you asking for this item? What does it do? How much is it going to cost? Why does it cost so much? How much does it cost over the life cycle? Not just for that particular period. So you have your public hearings and markup. Again, my example was if you submit an award, you know it's going to get marked up, right? You submit it, you placed it in the hopper, you send it to your personnel folks or whoever, your admin folks, then it goes, whether it's your first sergeant or whoever your admin personnels are, they review it, then they mark it up. I used to have a commander or XO who used to use a red pen. And I used to hate that because you could see all the red ink dripping. So when they mark it up, they give you an opportunity to then go back and fix that bill. What is a bill called once they fix it? Once you fix it?
Enrolled?
No, we're not enrolled yet. We're not enrolled yet. So after they mark it up, a clean bill, right? So after they give it back to you, for you to go back and fix that award bill, it becomes, the new term is a clean bill. You want to clean it up, take all those red marks off. Then it goes for consideration in the House and the Senate, two parts of Congress. The House reviews it, the Senate reviews it, they come up with their decision. Then they have to compare their decision. Chances are, regardless if both the House and the Senate are Democrats or the House and the Senate are Republican, it don't matter. They're going to disagree. So they're going to have disagreements. What is it called when they come together to resolve those disagreements? What is the term?
They enter into conference?
They enter in a conference. That's correct. Conference committee, or another name for it is the third chamber of Congress. That allows them the opportunity to come together as a group. House, one side of the House, one side of the Senate. They come together to resolve differences in a conference committee, the third chamber. The only purpose of them is to work out the differences because, again, once it's got to pass in one form. When the bill is then passed in one form, what is it called? What's another term for the bill? So we talk about clean bill, then we talk about them going through the floor in the Senate with it. After the bill has passed one body, either the House or the Senate, the bill is called what? Engrossed. So that's really, I think I kind of switched it back there. Engrossed bill. And then the engrossed bill is what's used to determine the differences. Then the bill, once it's published in one form, one bill goes to the president for the president to sign. What are the options the president has once the president gets that bill?
He could veto it.
He can veto. What does veto mean? He can veto. What does veto mean? He can reject it, right? Can he just decide and mark out part of that bill and then not reject the whole thing? Why not? Why can't he just mark out part of it and then just sign it and let it become law? Can the president do that?
Not anymore.
Not anymore. When did it change?
86, 96.
1996, that's correct. What is it called? What happened in 1996? Line item veto. So even though it's not on the page, I'm just talking the story. I'm talking the story through. So in 1996, President Clinton was allowed to get a bill. He was allowed to mark through whatever he didn't like, mark it through, then he was allowed to sign it for it to become law. Eventually, the courts deemed that was unconstitutional. So a veto is rejecting the entire bill and returning it to its originator. What are some of the other options the president has when he receives a bill? He can choose not to sign it, but how does it still become law if he doesn't sign it? What are the conditions? Congress must be in session. So the president receives the bill, and it means also the president's got to be in country, right? So usually have people ask, they mean the president has to be available because there's a timeline. So Congress is in session. What else? What is the president's timeline when he gets a bill? How many days? 10 days. 10 days, right? What does the law says? When does the president have to submit the budget? Since we're talking, let's switch it to budget specific. No later than the first Monday in February, right? I'm just throwing that in there. All right, so if the president receives a bill, he does not sign it within 10 days, and Congress is in session, that bill would automatically become law. It means the president does not have time, don't want to address that topic. He doesn't care if it becomes law, so he doesn't deal with it. What are some other options? So we talk about does not sign but allows the bill to become law. We talk about veto. What are the other two options? Pocket veto. So what's the difference between the pocket veto then? We talk about a regular veto, but then what's a pocket veto?
Congress is adjourned.
Congress is adjourned. So pocket veto goes with the does not sign but allows to become law. Scenario is the same. The only difference is does not sign but allows to become law. Congress is in session. Pocket veto is does not sign within 10 days, but because Congress is adjourned, Congress is not in session, then it does not automatically become law. Just kind of sits there. The action is a pocket veto. And then the fourth one is approval and signature. He signs it, he approves it, it goes forward. So then that bill goes to Congress. So the president submits the budget side now. So think about a typical bill comes from Congress, goes to the president determines to sign. The budget functions a little bit differently. The budget flows from the president to Congress. Congress goes through it, determines what the guidelines, approvals are going to be. Then once it's finalized, it goes back to the president for the president to sign for it to become law. So that's the difference between a regular bill and the budget. All right, so functions of Congress. Once the president submits the budget no later than the first Monday in February of that particular upcoming fiscal year, it goes through Congress. What is the first phase of congressional action in the budget process? What is the first phase when the budget gets to Congress? What is the first thing Congress does? They go through the budget resolution process. What are they doing in that budget resolution process? So budget resolution, first of all, which House and which Senate is responsible for the budget resolution process? The House and Senate Budget Committee. That's correct. So for each one of these phases, you need to know which House and which Senate. So the House and Senate Budget Committee, when the president submits the budget to Congress, the first thing Congress does, those two particular committees, is they have to determine what guidelines they're going to use collectively to look at the president's budget. They want to know from the Congressional Budget Office, what did we approve last year? What is our revenue? What do we take in? What are our deficit? How much do we owe? And so forth. And it's listed in that on the budget resolution. So on the House committee, House Budget Committee, Senate Budget Committee, they all both look at the president budget. They determine what their priorities are going to be, what they're going to look at, and so forth. The budget resolution process is a concurrent budget event. That means actions occur in both the House and the Senate. This particular phase does not go to the president it doesn't need to become law. This is just the process that Congress used to determine the guidelines that they will then use collectively to decipher, to approve the president's budget. Then the second phase of the budget process is what? Congressional action. What's the second congressional action? After they complete the budget resolution process, what is the second process? Authorization, right? So the next phase is the authorization process. What is the purpose of the authorization process? To authorize what? What are they authorizing? Authorizing programs. They're authorizing the things that we will be allowed to use those funds for. So regardless if funding is listed in the authorization, it does not give us a budget authority. Which House and which Senate is responsible for the authorization process? The House and Senate Armed Services Committee. That's correct. So the HASC and the SAS, they do the same thing. They look through the budget and they look at what category of things, because they know they're not going to give you all the money you asked for. So they look at what category of things they plan to approve in this budget. What is the third phase? And the phase that gives us budget authority, what is it called? Appropriation process. Which House and which Senate is responsible for the appropriations process? The House and Senate Appropriation Committee. The process is the same. House and Senate committee, they review the budget. Now they're actually going to approve appropriations. Now understand, Just because the authorizers authorize a program, it does not mean that the appropriators is going to automatically put money towards that program. I need to make sure you understand it. So if, let's say, the authorizers approve 5 programs, it doesn't mean the appropriators is going to approve money for only those 5 things. They might have their own agenda. So don't get caught up in thinking, okay, well, they're only going to give me money for their programs that are approved. It just means for us is we cannot request funding for anything that's not in the appropriation. That's what we really care about. All right, so if funding is approved in the authorization law, it doesn't mean we have appropriation. If a funding is approved in the appropriation, that's where we get our budget authority. We have funding. Since, remember, the first phase, budget resolution does not go to the president. You need to remember that the authorization and the appropriation process ends with that document going to the president for it to be signed or veto or whatever else, those 4 choices, that it has to go to the president for it to become law. What are the DOD applicable appropriations called? What are the DOD specific appropriations? There's 12 of them, but DOD only cares about 3. Let's put it that way. What are the 3 that directly go ahead? Defense. Number 2. Military construction, veteran affairs. Thank you. And what's the last one? Energy and water development. So even though there's 12 specific major appropriations, the Department of Defense is directly impacted on what happens to 3 of them. To 3 of those: defense, military construction, veterans affairs, energy, and water. All right, so once Congress appropriates the money, 2 things happen. What is the first legal thing that happens? The one that's actually tied to a law. Everybody should be answering. Go ahead. Nope. Legal. Legal. One that you can tie directly to the law, to the Constitution. What is the legal action? Hello. Article 1, Section 9. So Treasury issues what?
Appropriation or treasury warrant.
There you go. So 2 things happen when Congress appropriates the money. On the legal side, that's tied directly to that Constitution, the Treasury issues the Treasury warrant or the appropriation warrant. That's the Treasury letting everybody know that, yes, we have an appropriation law in place. Yes, we've been notified. Your accounts is ready to be charged against. So Treasury warrant. And what is the second thing that happens after Congress appropriates the money? More of a process. So the second thing that happened is OMB begins the apportionment process. Apportionment process. So whenever you hear the word apportionment, understand it's between DOD and the agencies. What is the apportionment document called?
SF-133.
The SF-132? The SF-132 is the apportionment. So what happens is once Congress appropriates the money, The agencies is responsible for completing the SF-132. They submit the SF-132 to OMB within how many days after appropriation?
10 days.
When in doubt, say 10 days. Except for how long does OMB have to issue their apportionment? 30 days, right? So the agency submit the SF-132 within 10 days of appropriation. Then OMB has 30 days to submit or give them their apportionment. That's a lot of A words. Appropriation, apportionment, and what does DOD, how does DOD give us our funding? Allotment, right? That's the other A word. DOD issues allotment. Then we commit, obligate, and we disperse. Is disperse used in the CDFM? What is the term used in the CDFM? Outlay. So outlay is when the money comes out of the treasury to pay the bill. That's an outlay. Yes, we know in our layman's term is disbursement, but again, if you're trying to pass the CDFM, you need to know outlay. So outlay, the funds are removed from the treasury. And then in most instances, you have to submit an SF-133 expenditure report from DOD to OMB explaining, based on what you requested, based on what you received, your planned versus your actual. And I'm sure at some level you're doing the same thing. You got to explain, hey, you received 5K, but you only spent 3K, explain, and you have to do it. So on the higher level, at the DOD level, now they have to submit quarterly the SF-133 expenditure report back up to OMB to explain their expenditure process. And we haven't talked about GAO. What does GAO stand for? Recapping. That's all I'm doing is recapping from last week. And
Government Accountability Office.
Government Accountability Office. Where do they come into play? We didn't talk about them this morning, but we did last week. What do they do? Who do they work for?
They work for Congress.
They work for Congress, right? So we know GAO, we said OMB works for the president or the executive branch. GAO works for Congress. What do they do for Congress?
They provide oversight of approved funds.
They provide oversight, that independent auditing agency, correct. That independent auditing work agency that provides oversight. Because Congress says, yes, you can do this. These are the programs we're authorizing. This is how much appropriation you have. These are your fences. You can only use it for this. But Congress don't have time to check us and make sure that we're doing what they said. So they have the GAO to do that on their behalf. The GAO checks the executive branch. So you have to think about it. When you get the budget, you fall under the executive branch. That's why the president is the commander in chief. So kind of think of that hierarchy, that structure as you go through this process. All right, so the last thing, we got about 3 minutes. We're going to end with revenue. How does the government make most of its money? What are the key categories?
Income taxes.
Individual income tax and what are the two big pockets? Social Security and Medicare. Those are the two big pockets of money. They charge us Social Security and Medicare out of our paychecks, and they increase our individual income tax. So we got to pay taxes. So those are the majority ways in which the government makes money. What type of bills does the government have? It has mandatory bills, and then we have some of the revenue that we can pay. We have discretion in what we pay. what is the percentage of mandatory bills, must funds, right? Because we use that term quite frequently. Is the percentage of expenses of the revenue that is spent on must funds?
70%.
70%. So 70% of the bills that the government pays, think about it, out of 100, 70% of the bills the government pays are must fund. And only 30% is left, and the term is discretionary spending. And of that 30%, how much does the DoD get?
15.
Over 15.3, which is a little bit more than a half. And everybody else. So when you say, okay, why we don't have enough to pay teachers? Why don't we have this? Because everybody else gets that other 14.7% of what's left of the discretionary budget to spend funding on. So what questions do you have of me? CDFM Module 1, Competency 1, or Competency 2? As you can see how the information overlaps. What are your questions? And as you're doing your studies also, is you want to do the same thing. Don't just study one section and, okay, let me go to the next section. Always, if you finish one section, go over from the beginning. And at this point, you should start just flipping the page, look at the topic. What are we talking about on that topic? Next page, talk about that topic. And kind of, you should at some point get to the point where even if you just see a topic, then you start recalling all the things in the subsequent pages that you went over. All right. That is all I have for CDFM Module 1, Competency 2, Manpower Management for today and the review. Any other concerns, questions? Okay, if not, that's all I have for today. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. Please be sure to subscribe to YouTube so I can maximize whatever I'm trying to do on YouTube as I try to learn the process. I did record, and I do have video this week's session. So if you want to go back and kind of go over some of the things that we went over today, there's on the YouTube page, there's also a video session for today's session. So thank you guys for stopping by. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. Thank you for stopping by.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.